At any given moment of the day or night, your brain is receiving signals from the world, the outside world and from your inside world. And depending upon the nature of these signals, your brain will make some decisions about whether or not you are safe, or whether or not you're hungry or thirsty, or whatever need your body has that will promote your optimal survival. As we've talked about before, when the brain receives novel or unfamiliar signals from the outside world, that is sufficient to essentially get the attention of the brain. So the first step that happens when you are faced with any novel incoming information that might actually be threatening, is to activate your basic alarm systems in your brain. And there are really very many neural systems involved in the threat response and the stress response. Probably some of the most important are those which we've talked about before, the noradrenergic, serotonergic, and dopaminergic neurons and their neural networks that originate low in the brain and send direct projections up into every other part of the brain. Now, as your brain's taking this information in, it's matching it against previously stored experience. And if there is a true perceived threat, your brain essentially starts to activate certain systems in the brain, and it starts to shut off other systems in the brain. And I'll talk about this in a moment, but I want you to appreciate this. There are multiple ways in which your brain allows you to respond to a threat. And part of what will determine what specific fashion you use to cope with an incoming threat will be essentially the nature of the threat. If your brain determines that this incoming threat is something that you may be able to fight off or run away from, you will activate systems in the brain that activate what we call the fight or flight response. And everybody who's watching this series has probably heard of that. The fight or flight response involves certain systems in the brain, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate will go up, you'll release sugar from your muscles, and you'll prepare to fight or flee. Blood will course from your body out into your muscles. All of the mental mechanisms that are involved in processing irrelevant information that's not specifically threat-related will just shut off. It doesn't matter if, for example, even if you've got a physical injury, if you get a cut on your leg or you get shot in your arm, it doesn't matter right now because you're focusing on what that threat is. Now later on, when you're not in that immediate threat-focused mode, you'll notice that you got cut or shot and that you hurt. But in this current state, this fight or flight response allows you to tune out all distracting information and focus on the external threat. Now, the neurobiology of that is relatively complex. It involves the HPA axis. It involves the release of adrenaline in the periphery, the release of cortisol, and it involves the activation of the noradrenergic or norepinephrine-containing neurons in the brain. The amygdala is involved, and lots of other systems and important things get activated in your brain. Now, there are times when the incoming information and the threat will be perceived to be something that you can't get away from. You can't fight this off and you can't run away from it. So and this is a wonderful quality of the brain's basically saying, all right, there's a probability that I'm going to get injured. I'm going to lose this fight and I can't run away. So should I have my heart rate at 160 and pour all my blood out to my periphery? Because if I get cut, I'm going to bleed to death. So your brain says, no, that's pretty stupid. So what you need to do is prepare to be injured. And that's when your brain starts to use this dissociative adaptation. And that's a whole different set of neurobiological responses that release opioids, your body's endogenous painkillers. It allows you, rather than being intensely focused on the external threat, it allows you, oddly enough, to kind of disconnect from that threat and be almost like an observer. So you have the sense that something's taking place, but your sense of time gets expanded and distorted. In some cases, if it's extreme and unavoidable, you can actually use mental mechanisms to completely psychologically escape. Little girls who are being raped at night repeatedly by mom's paramour will have the mental capability of literally, instead of being externally focused, to be internally focused, and they can retreat to a psychological place where they're safer. It's a very powerful adaptive mechanism, and it is protective. And what will happen is, if the traumatic experience is persistent enough, if it's repeated enough, if it has the qualities of being inescapable and painful, very often like the experience of many young children in a traumatic experience, the brain will make these adaptations and will develop a sensitized, if you will, somewhat overactive dissociative capability. So that later on, even though the young child is not being actively threatened, when there's a minor challenge to the child, novelty, transition, a test, they're able to turn on this dissociative response, and it makes them tune out. Now, the hallmark of trauma-related mental health problems is that the responses that were originally adaptive during the traumatic event, that helped the child survive the traumatic event, because they are so persisting and because there was so much repetition in the neural systems that mediate these responses, those neural systems have changed and they've become sensitized and they're abnormally altered. And depending upon what predominant style of adaptation you use, you can end up with very different kinds of clinical presentations. The child who uses his fight or flight response again and again and again will end up with attentional problems. They will have what we call externalizing symptoms. They might be more aggressive, they'll be more irritable, they'll have sleep problems, they'll be anxious. And very often these children get labeled as attention deficit disorder, conduct disorder. Children who have inescapable and unavoidable traumatic experiences that cause them to dissociate end up with a different presentation. They will frequently have what we call absence seizures. They will, or look like they have absence seizures. They tune out all the time. Now, they don't act out, but they tend to be very quiet, very withdrawn, sometimes very compliant. And interestingly enough, teachers, foster parents, clinicians usually don't identify these children as needing help because they're good kids. Now, they hurt inside, and they're anxious, and they dissociate, and they're depressed. And as they get older and they become young adults, they're much more likely to seek help themselves. Sometimes they don't understand that there's a relationship between their earlier trauma and the way they feel now, but sometimes they do. It's interesting that the most common way that these children present to public systems when they're young is not in the mental health system. It's actually in the healthcare system. They're referred off to pediatricians or to neurologists because they have what look like absence seizures, petit mal seizures, where they tune out and they just seem to be daydreaming, and you have to kind of, snap your fingers to get them to re-engage. They also frequently will have fainting. I talked earlier about the Vietnam vet who's walking down the street and hears a car backfire and his heart rate goes up and he activates this fear response. Well, if you are a young girl who had lots of, let's say, abuse by the hands of, mom's boyfriend, and he wore a certain aftershave, 10 years later walking down the street and somebody walks by you and they have that same aftershave, that smell can trigger your dissociative response. And rather than having your heart rate go up, your heart rate will go down and you will actually get lightheaded and faint. So syncope, or fainting, is what we call it in the medical world. Fainting and referral for potential seizure disorder are the most common ways that dissociative children end up in public systems, not through the mental health system. This next set of slides will illustrate several important clinical points. And I want you to remember as you watch this that this process of how the way we think and the way we behave changes as we move along the arousal continuum I want you to remember that that applies not just to maltreated children, but that applies to everybody. What I'm about to describe is a universal phenomenon of the way the human brain functions under various stages of arousal, fear, and then ultimately terror. And this is relevant in large part because the clinical settings and the therapeutic settings and the caregiving settings that we've set up for our high-risk children actually put our primary frontline workers at great risk of functioning all day long in a state of distress. When you're the only person in a special ed class and you've got 7 kids that are really struggling and you are trying to do your very best to both contain their behaviors but also to teach them, you are essentially on your own. It's a very challenging job. And no matter how wonderful you are and how centered you are and how much respite you get in the rest of your life, you are going to find yourself feeling overwhelmed at times and distressed at times. And because of the mirroring neurobiology that we talked about before, a distressed teacher creates an environment in the classroom where it's impossible for anybody to learn. An angry teacher, an overwhelmed teacher, the same thing. You just cannot create a climate that's safe enough for children, particularly struggling children, to actually leave their comfort zone, move into the developmental hot zone, and practice new things. So, let's start with this first column. What this multi-stage graphic will illustrate is how different states, internal states of arousal, influence what part of the brain is in control. So, let's start here. When you are in a situation where the internal monitors in your body and the external monitors from your senses tell you that the environment is safe, that you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you're not sleep deprived, the environment is not socially complex. In fact, this situation is most optimally reached when people are having solitude, just because the mere presence of other people and the mere social nature of our brain pulls us to be externally focused when there's another person around. So you can't have the TV on. You can't have cell phones ringing. You can't have people coming in and out of the room. You need to be in a safe and familiar environment. Optimally, solitude, satiety, safety leads to this state. Now this state, unfortunately, in the modern world, the state of calm is pretty rare. People stumble into this by accident. They fall into it when they're taking a shower. All of a sudden, they'll find themselves, a good thought will pop into their head. Or they'll be driving home from work and sort of on a familiar route back home and listening to familiar music, and you sort of are in this zombie-like state, and all of a sudden, boom, a good idea pops into your head. And this is because the smartest part of your brain is now able to process information that you have been putting into your head over the course of the previous day or week. I can tell you now, and this is, people always laugh when I say this, but the fact is that when you go to work, you get dumber. You just do. I mean, it is a neurobiological given that the very act of leaving your safe and familiar environment, being sleep deprived, having deadlines and having tasks that you have to do each day, having a bunch of people that you have to interact with, having phone calls, having letters you have to write, all of those things pull you out of this optimal state of cognition. Now, it doesn't mean that you're, dumb, but it means that you are not in the optimal problem solving, not in the optimal creative state. And anybody who's ever had the challenge of trying to come up with new policy or create something unique will always tell you that the process requires time. It requires a certain kind of time, big blocks of time, where there aren't demands, where there aren't people all over you telling you, where is that product? And that sometimes the more you get pushed to get this product, the harder it is to actually do anything that's unique or creative. And this is really important because our entire world for our children, where we're trying to get them to think in these thoughtful, future-oriented ways, and we want them to think about college when they're in first grade, which is crazy. But instead of actually creating an environment that will foster creativity, we create and invent educational models that are basically authoritarian. They are overly structured. They minimize opportunities for free play. We overschedule our children. We minimize recess. We minimize opportunities for spontaneous, non-structured experience for children, which is very important for creativity, very important for fostering curiosity. And unfortunately, rather than having an educational model that fosters and develops leaders and inventors and creators, we have an educational system that is creating workers and employees. So, here's where you are, and I am, and we all are, most of the day. And that's if it's a good day. Now, you can go to work and things can be so overwhelming and so complex that you will move along the arousal continuum, and your style of cognition moves from even this concrete mode to an emotional mode. You make your decisions based upon sort of reading nonverbal cues and affect-related stuff, and you pay more attention to attitude than to what the supervisor is actually saying. And it really is a different style of functioning. This also, by the way, tends to be the baseline state for most traumatized children. When they wake up in the morning, they're not over here and nice and calm and capable of processing information and thinking about the implications of their behaviors, thinking about what they want to be when they grow up, and I better not vandalize, the school because that could interfere with my ability to get into college, and I want to do that. These kids are basically living in the moment. Your sense of time collapses. The lower in the brain is in control of your functioning. And the more you move along this arousal continuum, the lower in the brain is in control of your functioning. So you can actually get to the point, if you have this continuing threat, where you are essentially reflexive and reactive. And this is what we will see with very many of these children that we work with. They're so tuned up, their stress response system is so reactive that if the tiniest little change in transition happens, or the tiniest little confrontation happens on the playground, or if they see a little bit of fight on the way in to school, or if there's a little bit of domestic violence that takes place, they will come to school in this state. And no matter how much the teacher talks and talks and talks and talks, the cognitive part of their brain, the part of their brain that should be learning state capitals and history and mathematics, is shut off. You could have the best teacher in the world, but learning is state dependent. If you are in a state of anxiety, you can't process information. Not only can you not internalize new information, you cannot recall previously stored information. And everybody's probably had the experience of having a conversation with somebody and saying, I read this interesting book and I can't remember the name of the author, and the more you tried to remember the name of the author, the more you couldn't get it, and when you're driving home, it pops into your head. Well, that's the life of the traumatized child. Even things that they've learned, everything is on the tip of their tongue. Whenever they're asked to sort of recall what they know about history or what they know about geography, they can't quite do it. But if you put them in an environment where they felt completely safe and there were no demands, they would be able to regurgitate the things that they do know. So, moving up and down this arousal continuum can happen in seconds. You can have a child who comes into the classroom and they actually are way down here, and they're actually accessible to the teacher's cognitive lesson. And they're learning something new. But the teacher can walk by and in a well-intended gesture of affection, put a hand on the shoulder of the child and as if to reassure the child. And as I said earlier, that if this happens to be a maltreated child or sexual abuse was an issue, it might be that touch is enough to move this child not only out of that state of cognitive receptivity, but all the way into a state of combative behavior. And this is one of the tragedies of the misunderstood, maltreated child. The child that has trauma-related changes in his or her brain will frequently be labeled by people who don't understand the child as being willful, violent, aggressive. They did that on purpose, rather than understanding that the child's behaviors are fear-based, that the child is acting this way because they literally have this internal state of fear that is persistently present and that is overreactive for any minor life challenge. The key to helping children move back down this arousal continuum is to create a climate of relational safety. When we talk about creating an environment of safety, that a child can be in their comfort zone and feel safe enough to want to leave their comfort zone, I'm not talking about, having child-proof plugs in the outlets. And I'm not talking about making sure that there's no big wood chips on the playground. What I'm talking about is relational safety, emotional safety. And the way you create an environment of emotional safety is that you as the adult stay calm. You stay calm. You stay in control. You be confident, you be nurturing, you be present, you be respectful, you be consistent in the way you reward and the way you give consequences. And that will create an environment of relational safety that will be sufficient for the children you're interacting with to be willing to take your hand and try something new. If the child doesn't feel safe, they will not leave their comfort zone. We talked about this earlier in terms of your comfort zone, your developmental hot zone, and then the cold zone. If you think about it this way, the ideal therapeutic environment, the ideal developmental environment, the ideal caregiving setting is one where there is a sense of safety and there are opportunities for exploration, so that when the child feels safe enough, they will go out and explore and practice new things, hopefully in context of a relational interaction where there's modeling, where there's guidance, where there's reinforcement, where there's reward, and where there is, at times when necessary, redirection, and there are consequences for inappropriate behaviors. If that environment's created in a way where the child feels safe, then the child will, on their own, choose to leave the comfort zone. But if you create an environment that's chaotic, unpredictable, there's other kids that bully each other in the environment, these kids see that there's inconsistency in the way the teacher is because some days she's nice and some days she's angry, and there's discipline isn't applied universally in a consistent way. If the schedule's inconsistent, if things are chaotic, we all choose to retreat to our comfort zone. Think about your own life. This is, like I said earlier, these things apply not just to high-risk kids, but to all of us. If you have a life where your week is filled with the same thing, day in and day out, you go to the same office, do the same thing, same office, same thing, same office, same thing, same office, same thing, same dinner every night, you're in a safe and familiar environment, and guess what you seek? You crave novelty. You want something new. When you are in an environment that's safe and familiar, you want to go on vacation. You want to go out and try some new restaurants. You want to do new things. But if you travel all week, and you're going from city to city to city, and you're in a new hotel and a new restaurant and meeting new people, you come home on Fridays, and what do you want? You want to stay home all weekend. The last thing you want to do is go out to eat. You want to be home. You crave familiarity. The key to successful therapeutic work is to create a climate of safety that is consistent enough and broad enough that the child will voluntarily try new things, explore new strategies for interaction, try new motor skills, try new cognitive things. And if you can't create that climate, you won't succeed. It doesn't matter if every Wednesday at 4 you have therapy. That's not what changes kids. What changes children is what happens in that hour at 4. Is it safe? Are you respectful to the child? Are you creating a climate where in that space, in that time, the child can practice new skills? Do they feel comfortable enough trying on a new strategy or thinking about a new way to solve problems? And if you can't create that environment, you're wasting your time. One of the most powerful and important memories that we create is the memory of our first relationship. And the term for this memory, this complex memory, which is in fact not just one association, but multiple associations, is an attachment. There are, as many of you are aware, multiple forms of attachment, but attachment is essentially the template memory that we create for relationships. And what I'd like to do is take a moment and describe a little bit about how that memory forms under two different circumstances. One we would consider sort of ideal, and the other one I think is unfortunately pretty typical of many at-risk families that we work with. So, reminding you of two important points. Number one, the brain, when it receives any novel pattern of neural activity, will activate the alarm response because the default response to novelty for the brain is that this is potentially threatening. So the brain, bottom line, doesn't really like surprises. Second point I want to reinforce is that the brain will make what we call associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. So things that happen at the same time, if they happen with sufficient repetition, get weaved together to create a unified network. And the process involves creation of new synapses and the co-occurrence of patterns of neural activity. Now, many of you may or may not know this. The vast majority of development of the brain actually takes place in utero. 400 billion cells. You're talking about neurons, glial cells, billions upon billions of cells. It's almost incomprehensible. From a single fertilized egg, in the course of 9 months, we create billions and billions of neurons. And these neurons migrate, they move to specific places, and they organize themselves in ways that are really pretty remarkable. By the time you're in the second trimester, your sensory apparatus have already started to develop. So you can actually feel things and the sensations of auditory input and visual input, which is very minimal, but you're building these sensory apparatus. What I want you to remember is that the rules of neural organization apply in utero. So in utero, your brain is making associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur, which means that your very first memories, the very first neural networks that you create come from the in utero experience. Now, you will also recall that I talked about the fact that neural networks and neural synapses get created in response to patterned, repetitive neural activity. And in utero, the most pervasive, universal pattern of input that's coming in from our senses is related to maternal heart rate. Maternal heart rate has both an auditory and a tactile component because the heart and the aorta literally move. So you get this, if you will, combined sensory input, all of which is coming in with this certain frequency. It's 80 beats per minute and the submultiples of that, because the heart valves open and close and open and close. So it's 40, 60, 80, 100, 40, 60, 80, 100, 40, 60, 80, 100. And your brain literally is organizing in response to this rhythm, which turns out to be therapeutically very important. So keep in mind that motor positions in utero become associated with other things that are going on in utero. Auditory input in utero get associated with other patterns of neural activity in utero. And let's think about what is happening in utero. All right, what other sensations are coming into the brainstem? Remember how I talked about there's these internal monitors that monitor oxygen and calories and whether or not you have other sort of external needs. Are you thirsty? Are you hungry? Are you cold? Do you have any needs for oxygen? And the bottom line is in utero, the answer is no in all those. So you're getting all the neural signals coming into your brainstem that are associated with being warm and soothed and full and satiated, and you're living high off the hog. It's awesome. In utero, it's not bad. And that's all happening at the same time that you're getting rhythm and rhythm and rhythm and rhythm. 80 beats per minute, 80 beats per minute. And then let's talk about what happens. So, if you look at this image, this little graphic, what I'm signifying over here is the darkness of being in utero. As you all know, it's dark in there, and it's wet, and it's warm. And all of a sudden, you start to get squished out. And it is painful for the squisher and the squishy. They both feel pain. And what happens is, not only is there pain, signals there's not enough oxygen. And this signal of distress coming from the inside, and then all of this novel information from the outside world activates your stress response to a level that you will never again experience. The process of spontaneous vaginal birth leads to an incredible activation of these alarm systems in your brain. Now, this isn't bad. It's not bad. You need this to jumpstart your heart, your lungs. This is the greatest sensory transition you will ever make in your life. You go from an environment where there's no light to light. You go from an environment where it's 98.6 to 72 degrees, which we think is comfortable, but babies think is freezing. They go to an environment from being completely, continuously encased and embraced to flailing around in space. Their arms have never done this. They've never seen anything. Their stress response systems are going absolutely wacky. So every stress response you have is activated. And what happens is babies will feel distressed. Now, I know we like to idealize the fact that newborn babies have this active alert period where they're not distressed, but that's just wishful thinking. Newborn babies are not looking around and going, oh, what a wonderful place this is. They're going, oh my God, what just happened? They're going, oh, holy hell, how did I get here? Their brain is going wacky. And they will let us know. They cry. So what do we do to quiet down babies? We reapproximate intrauterine cues. We turn the lights down. We swaddle them up. We rock them at what frequency? 80 beats per minute. Cross-cultural studies of rocking show that every culture rocks at the same frequency. Why? Because that's the average resting heart rate of the mother. Now, if mother was a trained athlete and her resting heart rate is 60, the baby prefers a different rhythm. If mother was hyperthyroid and her resting heart rate was 100, you have to rock the baby a little bit faster. The point is that when you provide the pattern of rhythm that was most consistently present in utero, that is associated with soothing. So, let's track this. Baby gets soothed, goes back down, falls asleep, and at some point, the baby will start to get signals from the body that say, I'm not getting food anymore. I don't have any glucose. And that is an alarm signal. And that will activate the alarm response to the level that it will wake up the baby. Now, this was the ideal situation. Let's pretend that this is a mother who's got a 5-year-old, and she has a 3-year-old, and she has this newborn baby, and she's got an auntie and a grandma and extended family and all kinds of people who can come and help take care of the older children, and she can spend time with this baby. So she's laying in bed recovering, and the little baby wakes up and looks around and starts to root around, and she, being an experienced caregiver, sees the baby close to her. She pulls the baby over and knows that the baby wants maternal care, whether it's feeding or whether it's warmth, whatever it is. And that level of moderate activation of the stress response gets to a certain threshold level where the baby wakes up and makes some of those grunting noises and maybe starts to cry a tiny little bit, but because the mother is there and responds immediately, she's able to plateau the stress response and then meet the needs of the child. Now, you will recall from an earlier part of this series that when you relieve physiological distress, it stimulates the reward neurobiology in the brain. So this child, in the arms of her mother, is now getting patterned, repetitive somatosensory signals from the smell, the touch, the smile, and all of these things from the mother, and they're going into the brain at the same time that the reward neurobiology is activated. And again, as we talked about earlier, this will get weaved together to create a connection between human beings and pleasure. The second thing that happens is, because this is a patterned, repetitive activation of the stress response, you build in a healthy, flexible stress response system. It's an interesting thing. People have developed this weird phobia about stress. Stress is not bad for people. Prolonged high levels of activation of the stress response is not good for you. But moderate activation of the stress response is not only good for you, it's absolutely necessary for you to expand your comfort zone. Every time you learn something new, what are you doing? You're being introduced to novelty. You're activating your arousal system. You're having a moderate activation of the stress response system. And when it gets too overwhelming, you go back to your comfort zone. And then you go out and practice again, and then you go back to your comfort zone. And that's what happens from the beginning in a healthy caregiving situation with an attentive, attuned caregiver. 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, when the baby gets hungry, gets thirsty, gets cold, the caregiver is present to meet the child at this level of moderate arousal and satiate their needs, which not only builds in this powerful connection between reward and human beings, and this template that you have for what human beings are begins to look like this. They meet my needs. They warm me. They're predictable. They're trustworthy. And because you are providing moderate, predictable activation of the stress response system, essentially like lifting weights, right? If you took your arm and you never lifted anything, you would not build any muscle here. But if you have moderate, predictable, repetitive activation, you build in muscular strength. It's the same thing with the stress response system. Moderate, predictable activation of the stress response system makes you resilient. A resilient child is not born. Resilient children are made. Now, sadly, many of the children that we work with, in fact, the majority of the children we work with, haven't had this consistent early caregiving opportunity. 85% of the children in the child protective system have some form of attachment problem, which means that they typically had some form of unpredictable, severe early life stressor, which led to vulnerability in their capability to deal with stressful experiences. And let's talk about what that can look like. If you have a mother who's depressed, if you have a mother who's overwhelmed, if you have a mother who's isolated, you're going to end up with less than ideal caregiving interactions early in life, which can lead to problems in creating those fundamental attachment capabilities. Let's walk through that. Let's pretend that this is a mother who has a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and has just had a baby too. But she's also brand new to the community. And she doesn't know any of her neighbors. She doesn't have her extended family close. She's not hooked into a community of faith. She has her baby, she gets her 48 hours in a hospital, and boom, she has to go home. Now, she's sort of got her neighbor to take the kids for a couple days, but that's pushing it because the neighbor doesn't know her, and these kids are a little bit, they're young kids, and they're a lot of work. So they go back home as soon as mom comes home. So she's got a newborn, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And she has to cook for them, she has to meet all of their needs, and she's on her own. And she's physically exhausted. So here's what happens. She puts the baby in her bedroom in a little bassinet. And when this baby goes through this little thing, when he wakes up, looks around, roots around, and guess what? Nobody's there. Mom is out in the living room with the 5-year-old and the 3-year-old, trying to meet their needs. She's exhausted. They're hungry. Where have you been, Mommy? What's going on? What's that thing in your room? Mom is wasted. She's tired. So the baby's rooting around. Nobody's there. This is a pretty unfamiliar world. Baby gets more anxious, more upset, starts to cry pretty loud, and gets to the point where not only is this child crying very, very loud, but beginning to suck air. So they get into this high, inconsolable state of arousal. It takes that much for the mother to hear the baby over the TV and the other kids talking and being 2 rooms away from the baby. So down the hallway is this baby crying bloody murder, and back in the living room is this exhausted mother who's trying to meet the needs of 3 children, all at different stages of development, all at the same time. So she turns on the television for the 5-year-old, the 3-year-old she drags in with her to feed the baby, and instead of being able to have this intimate moment with the child where it's quiet and the baby's needs are met, she feels anxious and overwhelmed because the 3-year-old's tugging at her going, Mommy, 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 and this inconsolable infant is screaming bloody murder, and she can't let down her milk very easily, and she's on her own. And you know what she's looking at? She's looking at night after day, after week, after month of this. And because of the mirroring neurobiology that we have, instead of reflecting back a state of calm and contentment that can quiet this child, this mother's scared and this mother's overwhelmed. And she's unable to easily calm this baby down. So the pattern of soothing is this inconsistent. Sometimes she's there and able to do it right away, but typically the child gets really, really anxious and overwhelmed and is not completely consoled before she has to move on to the needs of another child. And the problem is the association that this child makes in her brain between caregiving cues, human cues, isn't that you meet my needs. It's that sometimes you're there, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you meet my needs, sometimes you're sort of hostile to me. And I don't know what to make of human beings. So this is what we call the disorganized attachment. They don't know whether to approach or to avoid. They're all kind of mixed up. The other thing that happens, of course, is what we talked about earlier, that the stress response system is on in these prolonged, inconsistent ways, which leads to not a resilient capability, but a extremely vulnerable stress response capability. And these children have a much harder time with transitions in school, with forming new friendships, with normal developmental expectations, and they're on their way to being in the at-risk category.